Okay, yes, we're on.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for your interest in my work and for putting up with my rants. I hope they haven't been too polemical. But I do think it's important to have robust critique in our field, just like any other intellectual discipline. So this brings us to the end of at least my my tenure here. And I wanted to talk today more about the future of relational psychoanalysis. I think it has a very bright future. I mean, there's a lot of incredible work that's coming out. And I just want to kind of give you a little sketch of what I would be thinking about in terms of if I were inclined to want to refine this discipline. And it's really going to be incumbent upon, a whole group of people that have different sensibilities. So on one hand, what would new directions look like? What would the future of revisioning the relational canon look like? I think I believe, I can't recall the details, but I believe I did start out this seminar series by talking about how, relational psychoanalysis has become an international phenomenon. I mean, they have chapters on every continent except for Antarctica. I mean, come on. You can't deny how it's gone from a homegrown little, East Coast New York club to taking the world by storm on some levels. So why? We've discussed the reasons. I think some reasons is why it's so attractive is that it's outside of the scope of formal institutional life and training, and it broadens it. I mean, there's tons of relational training environments that are not analytic, and it opens up people's interest. I mean, there's a couple in Toronto, for instance. I'm not talking about the Contemporary Psychoanalytic Institute, but just little groups that identify as relational practitioners. There's a number of groups and psychotherapy associations, counseling associations that are now, latching on to relational terminology, and I don't think it's going to go away. So, what are the new developments that's happened recently, and where do we envision this going in the future is what I hope to cover tonight. One is you have a so-called relational turn towards self-critique, and that's that's introduced by actually two books that have been, for those of you that are aware of it, Decentering Relational Theory and De-Idealizing Relational Theory. They came out before, or maybe they came out after Lou Aaron died, but he and his friends Joyce Slotchauer and Sue Grand put these together, and so you've got the so-called internal critique that's happening within this movement, which in and of itself is a really good thing, because we really don't see that. I mean, do you see that among other psychoanalytic schools? You usually see people who are critiquing Freud would be anti-classical. You would see movements that happen that want to separate themselves or criticize or distance and then offer a so-called new paradigm that's better. And this has kind of been the history of psychoanalytic discourse, except for with Jungians. With the Jungians, they embrace critique. For those of you that aren't aware of that forgotten movement of traditional psychoanalysis, they're much more open to internal criticism and have a whole post-Jungian and a neo-Jungian branch. But we don't see that happening so much with the traditional movements, except for now we see this with relationality. And maybe that was Lou's vision, that he thought that this would be a good thing to do. However, given that I have read these, I was surprised that I was airbrushed out of critique. I mean, I'm not even mentioned, except for one passing thing by Donald Stern, who says he will not be addressing my criticisms. The rest is just, it's like I don't exist. And, to be quite honest, this is the way psychoanalytic politics works. You are either in the group, you're not, and you're going to not be welcome, you're going to be marginalized, or you're going to be devalued. But that's okay. I certainly am friendly with some relational people today, particularly those who, we can have disagreements. So some new developments that I just found out about is that Steve Kuchuk, who's as many of you might know him, he's like the next generation of coming up of relational practitioners, and Steve's a lovely guy, and we're collegial friends, and he has a new book out called I think it's called the something about relational revolution in psychoanalysis. So he's wanting to move this tradition forward. However, he has critiqued me as I actually haven't critiqued him personally, but he's critiqued me, and he differentiates what he calls a small r from a big R relational. And the small r relational are the people, even though that Mitchell introduced this notion, he would classify a small r practitioner, which I would fall under, as someone who came from an amalgamation of, let's say, the interpersonalist tradition, the British object relations people, as well as self-psychology. So Kohut, and he also lumps Stollerow and the intersubjectivist people into that group too. So it's like it's a big, it's a hodgepodge there. It's got some historical antecedents that leading up to what he then calls the big R, the relational psychoanalyst. And I think here he wants to, go beyond Mitchell. He wants to incorporate Aaron and that legacy. And he, in many ways, if I can do justice to his critique, he would say that I'm conflating these theoretical differences. I'm watering them down. I'm not showing fidelity to the redefinitions that the relational movement has gone through since my original critique. And he also says there's no singular school of the big relational people. There's no singular school. And in fact, let me pull out a quote from him. He wants to say, quote, each relational analyst defines and practices the perspective in his, her own particular way. Well, okay, we each define the way we want to conceive of our school and practice it in our own way. Well, in many ways, we all do that. What sets that apart as uniquely relational, but it also, it also brings into question, like, what is relational then? So I think if I were inclined, I would want to be very clear about how I define my new movement or tradition. Like, what sets it apart? What is it that is different from what other people have already discussed in very sophisticated ways that have kind of been, to use a Hegelian term, sublated? It's been incorporated into a more rich and robust model. Now, before I get into more details, what we do see about relational thinking is that they are progressive, and they have embraced a number of, social movements, whether it be feminist, queer, gender, other social theorists, trans movements, and in that way, that's very progressive, and particularly in today's times, right? I mean, with the Black Lives Matter, with the stuff that's going on with critical race theory, not to mention the social realities of what's happening right now in Minneapolis. So, I mean, these types of things are very progressive. Whether they're putting unique relational spins on them is going to be up to, I guess, others to decide. But it is up and coming. People who don't want to talk about otherness, difference, social realities, they're kind of behind the times. So it doesn't mean that other psychoanalytic movements, like, contemporary Freudians and things like this, wouldn't address these things, but we don't see them as like the spate of literature. I mean, I just got basically about 50 books because I'm on a book awards committee, and Lou Aron's new book posthumously came from his former partner, Galit Atlas, and she put together some of his seminal papers. We know that Philip Bromberg, who also just recently died, had a very lovely compilation, but this is several years ago, on standing in the spaces, where he put together many of his clinical papers. Excellent stuff. I mean, which reminds me I'm going to have to emulate. But the stuff that's coming out is progressive. It's on cutting edge, and I think in many ways this is where the relational movement is going to probably surpass other movements in North America in particular. Probably not worldwide, but who knows? We'll see what happens. However, unfortunately, the criticism about critiques, and particularly my critiques, have been to really deny the merit of them. Like, for instance, we keep seeing this mantra of the myth of the isolated mind. I mean, like Stahlero's thing, where this is wrongfully attributed to Freud. This notion of this two-person psychology versus the one person, as if Freud's was a one person. All you cared about was one person, and there was nothing else there. So this, quote, absence of the two-person model, I mean, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever in any of Freud's entire writings. I have them back there. I've not read every single thing, but I have read most of his work. There, I found nothing where he says the mind is isolated, the mind is solipsistic, it's a monad. It makes no sense. You have the mantra against drive theory, as if nothing's about drive. It's all about relationality. I'm taking liberties at the bifurcation, but no, it's not true that just because you are embodied and we have urges, and that we cannot deny the fact that we have been evolutionarily and biologically informed creatures, that negates somehow negates a relational ontology. And so I went to extreme forms to try to articulate this in a few books. For instance, when Freud talks about a drive, I mean, he has 4 components of a drive. You have a source. which is biological.
Energy.
There you go. Yes, you have an impetus. You have an object, and the object is usually other people, and you have an aim or a purpose or a telos, and that is to, a desire that's going to be fulfilled through whatever it may be, wish fulfillment, attachment, connection. Freud makes so many connections that are relational in his whole corpus. I go through his technique papers, his theory of culture, theory of mind, theory of culture. You can't have a human being, an individual subject that doesn't exist in relation to a social ontology. It just doesn't happen. But these are either straw mans, or they're put out there to exaggerate differences, to say that we're offering something new. No, you're not. No, it's just emphasis. And this whole stuff about Freud being a Cartesian and Stahler, we're going to enter into a post-Cartesian psychoanalysis. I just don't get it. I don't get why you need to exaggerate differences to make a point. I would be more inclined to want to carefully differentiate between the fact that, of course, we are embodied and we have urges, impulses, pulsions, pulsional desire, as the French would say, that are not, it doesn't exist independently of our social ontology. Getting back to phrases I like to use because it makes sense. We are interpersonally embedded in a world that we couldn't even possibly exist independent of. So there's no such thing as a solipsistic mind, like as if I'm a pure ego. How could it be? It couldn't. Like, we incorporate our world around us, objects, others. That's the whole notion of what internal object relations are about. Our internal dramas are the internalization of others, and particularly our significant others, our attachments to these significant others, and that becomes the content and context of our internal relational worlds. So let's not use that little trope anymore, because it's irritating, actually. And I just want to throw out one thing. Steve, who I really love him, he's a nice guy. Here's what he says. He says to me, in response to me, the fact is, a major change brought about by both relational, including but not limited to intersubjective theorists, and big R relational thinking, is that we no longer believe patients and analysts have isolated minds. our relational understanding of a two-person psychology assumes a significant theoretical difference from the classical perspective that Mills seems to prefer. So, again, it reminds me of Goebbels. You just say something over and over again, other people are going to think it's true. They are not going to think that I should go back and read the original, founders of our profession for themselves. They're just going to take secondary sources that tell them this is what others say. That is like the worst type of scholarship possible. Yeah, Alexander.
I hope it's okay if I just ask you a quick question about what you're saying. I don't mean to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Notice he also talks about how you misunderstand the mutual but asymmetrical principle, and I didn't really get that sense with your writing too. So if you could touch on that a little bit, because I kind of feel like you do understand it, but maybe there's just no mutuality if it is asymmetrical.
Yeah, great question. I'll answer it now. I wasn't planning to get to that. I think the notion that on one hand we're mutual, I mean that mutuality exists, and that of course we're unique subjects that are relating to one another, and that in that sense we are equal as human beings would of course apply. But this is where issues around theory and practice can become murky. So for instance, what do you mean by that, Lou, when you say we have a mutual meeting of the minds? And of course we do. This is what intersubjectivity theory is all about. So it's just basically a common observation that you're a subject, I'm a subject. However, of course, historically, I suppose some analysts would view the patient as a scientific object to analyze. I think in the true spirit of what Lou is trying to get at is that no, I'm not viewing you as an object. I'm viewing you as a subject, and you view me as a subject too. And because of that, we share a mutual relational field. But the issue about that is that it's always asymmetrical when it comes to a professional relationship. I mean, who would say otherwise? Who's going to spend an obscene amount of money to come and pay me so they can analyze me? I mean, that would be weird. I mean, what would we have there? But that used to happen. So for instance, Otto Gross and Jung had mutual analyses in these early days, and where they switched roles. Gross was, part of the asylum that he was institutionalized there for addictions and all kinds of traumas. And they would take turns. He would talk about their lives. Frenzy's, approach in many ways was open to that. He also did things that, they all did things that in those days we had no regulations. So the boundaries are very loose. We can't compare that time to now, but it often is kind of romanticized in some ways. Like there are some people that become friends with their analysts after they're done, and that's in that way there's some mutuality going on there. But I do think there's a firm distinction that we're equal in theory as human beings, but certainly not when it comes to professional work. Now, again, this gets also into questioning technique. And I don't want to poo-poo this because I think it's important, but it's also like, to what degree do certain practitioners take this to other limits, whereas others would put a kibosh on it. So when Lou Aaron talks about in the meeting of the minds, he talks about, he insists about his patient sees conflicts in him that he doesn't see in himself, and he asks them to elaborate on that and flesh that out so they can have a discussion. Well, maybe that might lead to an incredible, intervention. It might lead to insights. But to what degree would he be talking about admitting, yeah, I do have these? And to what degree would he allow himself to want to enter into, I'll tell you about my personal conflicts, versus maybe a more conservative analyst would just be interested in the transference projections and want to explore what that might mean about them. So it really is difficult, I think, to know exactly what goes on in each person's consulting room. And all we have to go on is what they write about. And so your question is, I think, very important. The other thing about that is how many, maybe it's just me, I do not have my patients telling me they want to form a relationship with me. I mean, it doesn't, the focus seems to be on you. You're here, I'm here for you as a professional. And then if we feel, we develop a sense of connection and that flourishes and that develops organically and naturally, it's going to naturally lead to me to talk maybe more about myself, more about my thoughts about you, or my personal life to some degree. You can't deny that in today's age. I mean, you write something, you're on the internet, somebody Googles your name, you have a web page. I mean, this stuff about anonymity is just, complete horseshit. I mean, we're about as transparent to the world that we would ever have been, by virtue of the fact you have to think about these practicalities in order to have a practice. I do know people who do not have websites. They just do, word of mouth and referrals. I don't know how they survive, but good for them. If they don't do any writing, I guess they're anonymous in that way. But most people, as I am told by some patients in the past, they'll immediately get your name as a referral or find you on the internet. They'll research you, and they already know a lot about you before even calling, let alone coming in. And if anyone watches this video, let's say of me, they're going to see who I am. And that's all, grist for the therapeutic mill, I suppose, if they come to see me, even though they won't. So let me get back now. Is that sufficient to address?
Yeah.
Right. I hope I'll flesh it out a little bit more, I'm sure. So getting back to some of I don't think that the relational movement needs to continue to, try to build a different school based upon negation of old. It has a lot it can go on. Another thing that I think's, rather suspicious is the notion of multiplicity theory. And here's what I hope happens. There isn't any such thing as multiple selves. If you have a multiple self, you have two different essences. You have two different kind of, personalities. They can't relate with one another. You couldn't have one essence that could enter into the essence of another in the mind. What you have is self states or ego states that have been segregated, compartmentalized, and dissociated from one another. And so I think if they were to pay attention to getting away from the multiple selves theorizing and just seeing how this is made possible, by a series of dissociative maneuvers that generate self-states that can exist independently within the unconscious, is probably a better solution than just saying that there are actually multiple personalities in the psyche. Again, I know that this is debatable. But anyway, the notion is, how do you refine theory? So you want to refine it in order to advance it. There are a few post-relational critics that have emerged, I think, since my original critique article. I think Karin Marotta is probably one of the more well-known people who identifies as a relational analyst, but has also been quite critical or careful about self-disclosures and when to give them. You have the Israeli psychoanalyst and philosopher Nir Govrin, who's in Tel Aviv. He wrote a really excellent book on like conservative and radical perspectives on psychoanalytic knowledge. And he talks about the people who are fascinated with certain theories of models of psychoanalysis. They're fascinated with it. They don't want to move beyond it. And then, like, let's say the Freudians or the Kleinians, and this is all they view, and there really isn't much movement or change since those paradigms have been introduced. Or you could say Lacanians, whatever a rigid view I think he's trying to get at, versus people who are disenchanted. They're disenchanted with these paradigms, just, like uncritically accepting what has already been said. And those disenchanted groups, the relational school, of course, is one of them, wants to go and challenge that old genre, the old guard. So, but he's also looking at what is suspicious or in need of improvement within relationality itself. Another person is Robin Brown, and Robin is, he's a critical thinker in general. He's written a couple books, edited a couple books. He's a Jungian too, but he's a relational person. And so he has a very critical eye basically about anything. So he's unique. But these, I think what Steve Kuczek calls the relational people are the New York school. Well, the New York school, I guess that's probably pretty good. The American middle group is what I think Charles Pisano called it a few decades ago. But what is the New York school going to do here? Well, with its quote, turn toward self-critique, these two volumes are pretty, in my opinion, are pretty friendly. I mean, it's not what I would call a critique. It's not what Marx called ruthless critique in the, spirit of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Some would say they're quite superficial, and it's just a bunch of friends interviewing one another, and being quite respectful about so-called differences. However, what was interesting about one of these books is Jay Greenberg wants to set himself apart from the relational community now. given Jay started it with Stephen Mitchell, I was surprised to see that. He even got into some debates with Rachel Blass in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, that he says, no, I'm not a relationalist. So he says in an interview in one of the books that he really didn't intend for this to be a movement. And I think this was more Steve Mitchell's agenda. However, how do you step back from that? Because he did say these things in print. He did say in Beyond Oedipus that relational theory is a radical rejection of drive. And so he's got a legacy that he's got to have to answer to, and maybe he's matured and that's what he's doing, that he just wants to distance. I wonder also if it might be for many political reasons, because as we all know, everything is political. However, looking at this critical self-examination and need for self-reflection, which is what Joyce Slotchauer in particular says, it's presented as if these internal criticisms are fresh ideas. When I had already articulated my concerns like over 15 years ago, such as the idealization of theory. Let's not get caught up in that, but it's easy to get caught up in it because when you're young, when you're in training, you could easily become overly identified with a certain group. You want to belong to that group, and you see other ideas as unwelcome trespass. However, that's a transference to theory. I mean, we should really be kind of open to, critically looking at all these things and what makes sense and what doesn't. Let's not say just because I'm a member of the club here, I'm not going to pay attention to what other people say in general, or particularly bad things about me or us. Well, that's how you grow. That's how you develop. Like somebody says, you haven't addressed this issue in your work, and I'm going to say, oh, let me think about that. Have I missed something? Oh, that's nice. I mean, that's what dialogue is about. Real genuine dialogue is not, Altman's approach or Davies' approach. That is like, don't criticize me. No, a dialogue is, I have a difference of opinion. There's some reasons for it. What are your thoughts about it? And then you hear the thoughts and you see how they might be massaged into a different framework of understanding. Or you say that you still have problems on these levels. And as long as there's a receptivity to a dialogue, a dialectic, a discussion, then you have, a genuine, authentic interest in improving your thinking. The notion of the analyst epistemology is also something that is being presented in these internal critiques, such as when Joyce Slotchauer says, have we overlooked our patients' need for us to know? So instead of saying, I don't know, you have the Lacanian move, I don't claim to be the master discourse, and I don't claim to be the one that knows, and but there are certain things that we do know. I mean, let's not. Why is somebody coming to see us if we don't have a certain expertise? People expect us in many ways to know what the hell we're doing, and we don't, as an article of faith, we have to think that that's why they're there. So on one hand, there's a humility about saying, I don't know. We're here to figure it out together. And we will come to some kind of, mutual way of understanding this, versus the person who says, yes, I always, I know what's going on in your head and with you, and I'm going to be able to spew these really thought out and well-defined, interpretations that give some kind of explication that you'll just be enlightened. Well, I don't think that's ever happened in my practice, and clearly, I don't think I've ever really walked away from an analytic treatment or a session where I thought that, my analyst gave me some answer. It's just how it's metabolized, and particularly over time. And I think that's the beauty of the relationship, how things are conveyed, what's unspoken, but what's emotional. What questions that bring up other unanswered questions. So we discussed the notion of mutuality. Radical equality is another term they use in these critique books, self-critique books. There's no radical equality. I mean, again, not in the analytic relationship, other than the fact that you're a human being, and I acknowledge you as a human being. I can't even understand. I can't understand it. It'd be if that was the case, it'd be like your best friend or something, your intimate, spouse or significant other that you feel you're equal with, and you suspend agendas and judgments, and that's what unfolds. But that's not really what happens. At least it doesn't happen in my practice. Another thing is the call for self-restraint on speaking freely. Excuse me. So that's good. Yep. It's important to think it through, reflect, and just don't spew something out of your mouth because you're thinking it. It's amazing how many supervisees I've encountered where it's as if the so-called relational approach means I can just say and do whatever I want with you, just like you are with me. And I'm constantly having to say, well, just think about how what you just said may have been perceived and experienced and interpreted by the client. And so I don't think any serious relational analyst and practitioner is doing harm and damage to people. It's just that how are these things going to be interpreted? When Erwin Hoffman says, throw the book away. Well, hopefully you've mastered it to some degree first before you, just talk about whatever comes to your mind in the session, which is some of my supervisees. Another issue is they're talking about this notion of decentering the unconscious and want to rectify that, which is great. They are also critiquing dissociation, multiplicity, self-state theory, like Donna Orange in her chapter. Regardless, any of the self-critiques that are offered from now on, it really opens up a clearing that in the past was heavily occluded. If you start to challenge things, question it, it would be met with resistance, just like in therapy. And perhaps it was, encouraged by the relational founders. But now it seems like there's a new pronounced attitude of openness to this self-critique. But just want to say another caveat, like it really should be any critique. It shouldn't simply be within your own cohort. That, you know, criticism of ideas should be, you know, like open to universal opinion. I mean, we shouldn't really just discriminate. I mean, it should apply to everybody, all fields of discipline, and you know, regardless of whatever identification that we have with a particular analytic school, you know, critique is where you have movement and change and progression and innovation and progress. So that's where I hope to see, because if we don't do that as a profession, we're in trouble. I mean, we're already dying. I mean, I just wrote a paper for Arnie Richards' new journal called the Journal of Controversial Discussions, where I talk about crisis and ideology in psychoanalysis. And the notion is that traditional psychoanalysis is just going to die out on the vine in North America. It's going to be so small. This is at least my prediction. People are not seeking it out. And so the relational movement knows that. And it's adapting to the needs of the public. And, you know, like, people who are going into formal psychoanalytic training now, I mean, I suppose many of you that are here, you're in analysis with, you know, training person, and you're doing it to fulfill, you know, the requirements for your training. Most, I think, formal analysis this day are comprised of people in training, unless you're, of course, wealthy and you know, part of the elite that can afford it. But most people don't have the money or the time to deal with this, except for those who are really invested in their own professional and self-development. I did some brief research on different fee rates for analysts throughout the world, and it's incredible because there's many economies in the world that are very psychoanalytically you know, oriented and friendly, that are affordable. Like, for instance, in Britain, you could see someone for about 60 pounds. In Europe, it varies, but like, I know a internationally well-known analyst, Lacanian, who charges 40 euros. I am comparing it to, let's say, in Mexico, believe it or not, a psychologist makes $4 an hour. The average laborer makes 70 cents an hour. Isn't that incredible? When you go down to the Psi culture in Central and South America, let's say, you know, in Argentina, I mean, even taxi cab drivers are seeing analysts. I mean, it's an incredibly interesting culture that everyone realizes they need to have this kind of dialogue and exchange about their emotional and internal lives with the professional, and they're paying a common wage, like $20. I remember a few analysts, friends of mine, when they were in analysis in, let's say, London, particularly, I'm thinking of my friend Mike Thompson, Michael Guy Thompson, who was trained and ran R.D. Lang's, one of his houses. He saw Lang's for the going rate at the time was 12 pounds for a session. Lang's was charging 25. He had to always be higher. You know, I know Bruce Fink told me he was seeing an analyst for $20 an hour. I mean, in Paris. So these are big differences. So the thought that we in North America are charging, you know, outrageous fees is probably going to lead to a great demise of the traditional classical analysis that we're accustomed to hearing about or reading or going through. Getting back to the future of relational psychoanalysis. See, I've been more critical of the field's, the movement's lack of its own theory than I have about its clinical attitudes and its sensibility and technique. Even though I'm, you know, cautious about, you know, self-disclosure issues, as I think anybody should be, I've really praised the liberation of relational practice in compared to classical technique. You know, it's like, what do the masses want? The masses, the contemporary, you know, public is seeking out more of connectedness with people. And so, if anything, maybe the relational movement will, I hope, legitimize a form of practice, relational psychotherapy, that champions this evidence-based horseshit that we keep having to encounter all the time. Because at some point, this you know, chop shop approach, this you know, manualized following you know, certain protocols of treatment, people are going to say, this is so artificial, it's not useful, it's not helpful, it's a scam, and I would rather invest my energies and efforts into you know, a relational practitioner than some talking head who thinks that you know, what I think is irrational. I just need to change the way I, you know, conceive of reality and think happy thoughts. It doesn't work that way. So I'm hoping that over time, particularly if we get politically involved with insurance companies, with you know, the public. I mean, we really would benefit from social media outreach and public outreach, that some of this, the scientific-based hegemonies that have creeped into the economics of mental health care could be challenged, if not overturned, on some level in the future. And I think this movement could be very effective because it's infiltrating social workers, it's mental health workers, counselors, not just relational relational analysts. And with that kind of inclusiveness, there's going to be more you know, political clout and lobbying. Okay, let's see. I think I've already discussed the notion that the movement, in my mind, was built on negation of old paradigms versus innovation. And this is what I'd like to see. I'd like to see where is the innovation going to be in the future leaders and practitioners. Once again, when negation is used as a straw man to set up how we are different than the old guard, it's not really very convincing to me. So, for instance, when Seligman, in his recent book on infancy and child attachment, he characterizes classical theory. He refers to it as instinct theory. Well, Trieb is not, instinct, and he says if he hasn't read Freud. And again, it's being set up as though we don't agree with instinct. Well, as if there's nothing about the human being that's not instinctual, or the two-person approach, or whatever. The paradigm shift, that's another incredible trope. Paradigm shift, it only applies to the natural sciences. It does not apply to the social sciences. This is according to Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolution. So he would consider that theories and methods in social sciences are pre-paradigmatic. They're there's no proper paradigm. And so when things are saying we have a paradigm shift, people don't understand that, what we do doesn't really meet the parameters or criterion for natural science. So it's illegitimate to really, compare it to that, physics being the exemplar. So what I'm saying is that the revolution now needs evolution. It needs to change itself. It needs a facelift. It needs to sophisticate itself, and it could do it. There's no question. There's two tensions in my mind about this. One is there's no uniformity of theory. And if Kuchek's right that there is no singular, thread connecting relational thought, and that I think theory is different than practice, but if you'll give me some liberty, everybody practices the perspective in their own way, which of course we all do. But where does that lead us? It leads us to, some people could be just really radically subjective, or egoistic. They could be, collapse into relativism. I mean, it's just, is there anything that's universal? Is there anything that conjoins this movement in theory that defines it in a certain way? So if there's no uniformity, then we just basically have a mosaic of different, subjects and different subjective theories. So I'd like to see, how can they create a, more of a articulate, cohesive notion of relational theory. Now, one particular way out of that is to say there is no uniformity of theory, and you go to the opposite extreme. You create a postmodern psychoanalysis, and the postmodern view would basically negate any universals, and that they could, in theory at least, build an edifice that would be based upon a radical rejection of Enlightenment paradigms. Now that would also go against science. So you'd have to be really careful and sophisticated about your critique. the critique could be, we want to buy into the whole linguistic turn in philosophy. So let's take Don Stern, who talks about unformulated experience. He uses Gadamer as his guru, and he makes language the fulcrum of everything. Of course, we know that comes from a number of people. It comes from post-structuralists. It comes from Heidegger, and to some degree Lacan, and hermeneutical thinkers, and that also is preceded by Husserl and phenomenology. But that was before linguistic turn. Now you could do that. Another way is to go back to phenomenology, and you could only be interested in what appears, what presents itself, without making ontological claims. You bracket those. So that might be a direction that one could, flirt with and see where it takes them. I don't think they're going to turn to science. But at the same time, they have embraced attachment theory and attachment paradigms, which has to be grounded in scientific framework. Again, science is a loaded word. I mean, in Greek, the notion is really just about how do we know? So it's this epistemological question. And it wasn't so. It's not what we tend to think today. Is that there are universal laws that we discover that's mind independent and exists outside in the external world, and this is objective truth and reality. Well, there are certain things that I would say most certainly would fall into that genre of thinking. For instance, I don't think the chair or the room I'm in is a figment of my imagination. I don't think I construct it out of my fantasy, even though my psychic apparatus is all I have. So I can't step outside of my psyche. This is my psi world. And so the differentiations in my psi world is how I introduce distinctions, demarcations, and difference and similarities. And this is what I find myself immersed in or thrown in. However, there are others that would want to say that, that doesn't account for objective truths and facts and epistemologies and universals and a number of other things that postmodern thinking wants to challenge. So I don't have the answers here, but I'm just generating questions. I'm generating where things could interestingly flow into. I do like the thought that some relationalists are wanting to reclaim the unconscious in relational theory. At least they say so. And that's very important. It leads us to ask, well, what is the relational unconscious? What is it? What separates it out? So, the reality here is it's Freud was very subtle and complex in the way he wanted to introduce a model of mind. So of course he had to start from our embodiment. He had to start from an internal perspective or internal mediatory process, because that's what we are most certain of, is our internal experiences. And yet when let's say an infant has to be prepared in utero to breach into the world, that how do we understand that? How does infant observation research today lead to speculative theories about what must be going on inside the mental state of an infant? It's speculative in many ways, because we just don't know. We don't know what an infant's mind is thinking, but we can't deny the fact that there are certain, instinctual evolutionary currents that are operating, and yet when you think about the contents of the unconscious, they are the internalization of our relationship to everything in the world. And so a relational unconscious would have to privilege our internal dramas with other people. And yet it still can't discount the notion that we have our own endogenous wishes that are met with conflicts, that are met with defenses, and compromises that have to emerge, and yet we have new content, and it's subjected to a dynamic underworld that is swirling around, and we don't need to necessarily just cleave off things like embodiment and drive. We just need to incorporate the rest of our experiences in the world and how they would be assimilated. So you could have a really rich theory of the unconscious that doesn't negate other things but might privilege relationality. I think that has to be developed. Now there's also an integrationist pulse that's going on in a number of, I think, mental health disciplines. But how do we take in the old theory and put a new spin on it? Well, that takes some finesse, but it can be done. The other thing, though, is there are some of us that are interested in comparative psychoanalysis, comparing certain theories and subdisciplines to others. And they're looking for an integrative, comparative kind of way of bridging distinctions and differences, but trying to find maybe a unification principle that brings them into either dialogue with one another or some kind of simpatico. I think it's hard to, you just can't forget our history. So before the interpersonal movement in the East Coast, we have to look at the British the British object relations folks. Again, that was I want to go back to say that Freud was the founder of ego psychology and object relations before it even got off the ground, because he was analyzing the ego and the object before these movements even came into being. Another interesting notion is that when self-psychology came on the scene, it forgot, it's just using a new word. Instead of ego, it's called self. But what's interesting about that is that from a comparative point of view, Jung introduces the notion of the self that's never discussed in mainstream analytic audiences. And the notion of the self is one of which the self is a totality of which the unconscious is largely part of it. And the ego is our conscious self. So when we talk about the ego, we're talking about a self-relation to our sense of I, our sense of self as a personality. But there's all that stuff in there that we aren't aware of, that's autonomous, that these autonomous factors in the psyche that speak. The unconscious, the it speaks. And Freud, however, wants to make that element of the ego unconscious. So the ego becomes unconscious, it's conscious, and it's also a superconsciousness. It's a self-consciousness. It's the superego. And his system is it follows a developmental monistic ontology. It starts from a very crude form, and it becomes more sophisticated and over development based upon our relations to our parents, to others, to society, where we incorporate culture and the values and the mores of our parents, and hence the psyche becomes a very rich and robust process system. Sorry for the tangent. But some of these things could be worked out in a relational paradigm. But can you do it by not acknowledging our ancestors? No, not in my opinion. A new trend, and I think it's a good one, is the turn to social theory. So, you have more than I can remember in my training, my years. I think we're seeing much more of a social political activism than we have witnessed in traditional psychoanalytic training environments. Issues around race, critical race theory, cultural differences, immigration, the diasporas that have taken place because of the world we live in today. Sex trade issues. I think Adrienne Harris in particular. The ethical turn, Donna Orange in particular. She's just latched onto Levinas. We have eco-psychology concerns now with climate change and the environment. The issue around globalization and technology and geopolitics and economic disparities. These are all, world concerns. In fact, I'll put a plug in for my next book that's under review. It's called End of the World, Civilization and Its Fate. And I'm very much concerned about all these things that my relational colleagues have been writing about in social justice circles and social theory. And I feel that, we have a global bystander effect. People are not doing what they need to be doing. And they know it. They see it's happening, but it's like we're living in this dissociative disavowal. You're like, I know, yes, but, and it's as if the world is unconscious. It's not conscious of our, impending fate. That I think if we don't do something as a world, we're going, everything in our ecological crisis is going to lead to the possibility that we're going to destroy ourselves. And so that's my new interest in pursuing something. I think that if we don't address it, it's going to get out of control. Now I'm going to turn, before I turn it over to discussion, I'm going to turn it toward another thing that the relational movement could do is deal with a theory of technique. So if the problem is if every practitioner practices the perspective in their own way, as Kuchuk says, what's going to set it apart from other modes of therapeutic intervention? If everything's kind of a free-for-all and it's based upon your own experience and clinical judgment and training. Well, what has been done is that Roy Barsness, I don't know if you know him, but he produced a really important book recently on core competencies of relational psychoanalysis. And I'm not aware of it. I think that he provides the first comprehensive text on core competencies, in relational practice. Now, what he did was he used grounded theory as a way of approaching his data collection, and he uses qualitative analysis of interviewing 15 analysts who are self-identified as relational analysts. Now, of course, the number is very small, only 15. Whether we can generalize it is dubious, but at least that's a start. For those of you that might not be familiar with grounded theory, it's very time-consuming. You're sitting down, you're interviewing a person, you're taking transcripts, you're trying to take from the transcript threads of theory and propositions and argumentation that come out from the interview, and you have to categorize them. And then you have to do that with all of your subjects. And what he did was he came up with 3 primary categories that, so just 3 primary ones. And he refers to them as positioning, reflecting, and engaging. Now, out of those 3, he has 7 core competencies that he identifies. One is the intent or the purpose of treatment. Why does somebody come to see you? I mean, sounds sensible. The second is a non-authoritarian stance that is based upon collaboration, or a collaborative attitude. So again, very sensible. Third is very deep listening and immersion in the analytic process. I'd say that's what probably all analysts do. They're very careful attunement. Listening is probably one of the most vital skills we could develop. The fourth is the relational dynamics that take place between the patient and the therapist. Fifth is patterns or patterning and linking up patterns. The sixth is repetition and working through. Obviously, they read Freud's texts. The seventh is having courageous and honest speech, but disciplined spontaneity. That's interesting. Basically, be honest. At the same time, be careful about how spontaneous you are in your honesty. Now, what he did is he arrived at one core category. And the core category is what he calls love. So, is the relational paradigm defined based upon a loving attitude toward every patient that comes in? Keep in mind Otto Gross and Jung and Ferenczi and Ian Suddy and Binswanger. Binswanger took Heidegger's theory of Dasein as care or concernful solicitude toward others. And he said, what's more important is love. And communicating love in the therapy, in the relationship, is what's therapeutic. So there are many historical precursors who have arrived at this. We might say, does this beg the question on what's uniquely relational? But at the same time, we have to leave it to others, to readers, to make their own decision. Just as a side note, I've just retired from clinical practice, and I'm going to devote the rest of my life to my scholarship and teaching and life works. And in the process of terminating with people through this computer is incredible. I can't say it is what I would have wanted or preferred, but it just is the times. I mean, we're in a lockdown here in Ontario because the numbers are out of control, and we don't have the access to vaccines like you do in the States. But having some incredibly moving, experiences of saying goodbye, and even though it's through this medium, was beautiful moments, and expressing our loving feelings for one another. One of the patients I've seen for 20 years. So I certainly, even with this kind of restriction, with this impediment to the reality of being in the room with somebody, it didn't stop these natural feelings and thoughts and mutual recognition and things from developing and happening. And so I can very much say that I think Roy's category, the one core category of love, is very, very endearing and very important, particularly when you're ending with somebody you've seen for so many years. This brings me to, I know I have about 5 minutes before opening it up. Of course, the issue around self-disclosure, I think, is the self-revelations are where the meat and the contentions lie, if not the Achilles heel. What are people going to do about that? I mean, Karen Marotta actually gives some guidelines for when and when not to self-disclose. So she's thought this through in a few of her works. I'm thinking of her 2010 book with Guilford on psychodynamic techniques is the name of it. That's geared more toward training text, so it's useful. I think it's useful for those in training. Her new book is called The Analyst Vulnerability, which is coming out this summer, and I've read it and I endorsed it. So I would encourage you to pick that up. So she's talking about how vulnerable we are, and how our own childhood vulnerabilities define who we are as a person and as a practitioner. And she, without disclosing everything about her life, she sets the stage for a very tactful reflection or meditation on how these things get played out in very myriad ways. Again, another side note is this issue around self-disclosure. Like, how do we know when to do it, when not to do it? The same could be said for interpretation. When do we give an interpretation? When do we don't? What are the parameters for which? I will admit that I'm not very good at that stuff. And I also feel that the best interpretation comes from the patient. They are the ones who, are going to feel the connections and find that intrinsic meaning and emotional immediacy to their interior that makes sense to them, that I'm just, speculating. But having said that, the relational community should welcome, these types of discussions. They should have, these are controversial discussions that should be encouraged within their group and external critics. You have to bring in your enemy, so to speak, and sit them down at the table and have some wine and cheese. And it's like Derrida's notion of hospitality. I mean, we could bring you into a house. Let's say you're a Muslim and I'm an atheist. Come on in. We're going to have a good meal. And you tell me about yourself. Tell me about your life, your culture. And let's see where we're going to get from that. Now, these things also get into a number of things. They interweaves with professional ethics, our regulatory bodies telling us on what we should do and not do. And also, jurisdictional legislation based upon where you practice, the state that you're in, that have different laws. And we can't ignore that stuff. For instance, the state of California has a law that a practitioner has to show the patient a piece of paper and go over how that the two of you are not going to have sex with one another, and they have to sign off on this, and this has to be documented. And I've got a friend out there. I said, "Do you do that?" And he says, "Are you out of your mind? Hey, oh yeah, I'm going to form a relationship with you, and here, do you want to sign this piece of paper that says I'm not going to have sex with you?" It's the most analytic thing you could ever imagine, that a state imposes upon you, and if you don't do it, you're violating the law. So we have to use our judgments. I will end it and open up. I kind of wanted to save this. One other thing is on clinical theory. Not just about technique, but clinical theory that guides technique. And the person that I have honed in on is Andrea Salenza, who talks about the central feature of any analysis is why we're not going to have sex with one another. Now, I don't know why. I have a whole critique of her in my book here. My last plug, Debating Relational Psychoanalysis. I'll give you a discount code if you want it. I critique that. But the notion here is that clinical theory is probably the most plastic and fluid of all things. And I think the relational school has a great deal of thought to contribute to it. And I hope to see what they do in the future. So with that, I'll stop blabbing, take questions.
Thank you very much, John. Let's open up the floor now. Alex?
Yeah, I guess I'll go off of some of the stuff you wrote in the Core Competencies of Relational Psychoanalysis book, which I guess what stuck with me is the paragraph on malleability. You kind of discuss how a wild analysis can take over and how there's kind of a need to demonstrate some type of treatment efficacy. And I guess just my concern as somebody who's going into the field and, trying to become a psychoanalyst is that there really is a need with insurance companies and just, I think, the public as a whole, to really prove that there is something very systematic about psychoanalysis. I'm not saying to hold it rigidly, but with this movement and how popular it becomes, it kind of gets to the point of how we've talked about anything goes. And when that happens, it can be very hard to prove the efficacy of one technique or the other, because we really don't know what people are reporting is really traceable, or that they've done that, or there's any type of this technique works well with this type of patient. And it all just kind of becomes very convoluted and very hard to convey to somebody who's more of a layman who doesn't really know psychology or psychoanalysis. And I just was wondering if you could expand on that, and is that concern something that you share as well, or am I kind of maybe going in a different direction with it?
It sounds like that you're really more talking about how do we deal with the politics of mental illness and insurance and reimbursement and our image to these people. Yeah, and we do have an image problem. There's no doubt about it. But if you're using the lingo of evidence-based, like for instance, there's so much data that people have studied that they talk about attachment in the relationship is more or less the glue or the fulcrum of how people get better. And if we see a shift away from technique-oriented discourse, and we talk about process, that, what do you talk, like when you have an insurer saying, you have to prove that what you're doing is evidence-based or scientific. They want to know, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm a psychotherapist. I practice psychotherapy. I practice evidence-based psychotherapy. What kind? Well, I just can't say, because I've been trained in so many models. And you have this little dance going on. So you either don't engage in the dance. You don't have to justify who you are, because look, I have credentials. And you can't ask these questions about patients because you're violating the privacy. So I can't really tell you this. Why are you questioning my credential? It should be the psychology board or the licensing board that gave you the license. They say I can practice. So I don't get into those things, but it is a big issue. If we don't have a certain justification for what we do behind us, and like for instance, when someone says psychoanalysis, you call it psychoanalytic therapy, psychodynamic therapy. You water it down to make to appease people in power around decisions. But if somebody says that it's not scientific, and that this is often a criticism, you'll say, well, that's not true, because Dr. Seidler's wonderful article with 300 studies that say otherwise. But with the American Board of Professional Psychology, we have to go, I'm on that board for psychoanalysis, we have to go through our accreditation, and for again, the hoops, going through the hoops, the people on that committee have compiled over 800 studies. So it's incredible. You just simply say, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't understand what science is about. You don't understand what therapy is about. And I prefer not to get into that discussion with a adjuster who knows absolutely nothing.
Sure.
Nothing whatsoever. But your question is, I can go on because of all the business pragmatics of running a practice is so intimately tied into who's paying. And issues around panels, it's different up here where I live, but issues around panels, not, it's complicated. The thing is that I think it should be incumbent upon us to have a, an argument for what we do, why it's effective. And if someone's outside of their area of expertise, we would want to call them on that respectfully and professionally, that they're, with all due respect, you don't understand what I do or what our field's about. Often, though, if you get into a pissing match with an adjuster, it probably is not going to be good for you or your patient. So I'm sorry, Alex, if I don't answer this in incredible detail, but I share some of the pain that you're suggesting.
I'd like to bring up the issue of timing. It's one of the least spoken about issues of them all, and yet probably at the core of what decisions an analyst makes at any given moment. And very few people, if any, have really referred to timing. The closest that someone came to it, to my knowledge, is Winnicott, who talked about when to make an interpretation. And he said, you make an interpretation at the point of urgency. Okay, what's the point of urgency? It's the point at which the patient is just about to come up with that interpretation on their own. And he then adds, but if the patient is about to come up with that interpretation on their own, let them. So what's the point of urgency? I don't know. It's these are the difficulties that your presentation points up. Timing matters, sensitivity matters, but the ability to have a dialogue and have the verbal back and forth is very important. Without being so thin-skinned that it becomes very personal. From experience, that's exactly what did happen. And it's unfortunate because you raised some very good issues and you're still raising those issues. And I'm sad to hear that they're not paying attention to you where they ought to.
Well, thanks for the the support there. I think I moved on.
Good.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Don't be cowed at this point. You got nothing to lose. We won't see you again. Linda, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, okay, I just figured out how to unmute myself. I'm a technical genius. What do you?
Absolutely.
Anyway, so on that note of timing, it's really interesting. I'm reflecting back to when I started social work school, and my first experience with social work school was in Israel, in Jerusalem at Hebrew University at the School of Social Work. I was all of, I don't know, I think I was 18 or 19, and I was getting my bachelor's in social work. And one of the first classes was a group, to talk about technique. What are we even doing? How do we even start? And it was, there was sort of this Rogerian, Carl Rogers approach in the first introduction. And of course, I'm sitting there with a group of Israelis, and this is around in 1974. So it was the, right after the Yom Kippur War, and Israeli society and Israelis then were, it's like the epitome of practicality. That's very much, then was very much the thinking, the Israeli mentality. And the instructor said, we were talking about, you always start where the client, the patient is at. And all these people, these Israelis in the group looked around and said, well, why wouldn't you start where the person is at? Who would even think of starting someone is not at? And they're all discussing this, from a practical point of view. And, what does this mean? Come on, let's get on to something that's significant scientific. This is a lot of hogwash. And it was just very interesting how that evolved over time. And we all came to a very, deep understanding of it, but it's still, even in the process of a long analysis with a patient, the patient has to be ready to hear and to take in. And it's really a part of the patient's emotional growth. So it's something that I don't know if there's a formula. We can't give a formula to an insurance company. The patient has to do A, B, and C before, he's going to grow or change or overcome his depression. But it is something you learn, I think we all know it's something you learn over time. And it's something you also experience in your own analysis. If you feel that you've had an analyst who's been caring and supportive and helped you grow, you know what that means. So anyway, it's just that experience always comes back to me at different times in my work. And sometimes it helps me slow down the speed that I want to work at. I don't want to be one of those, one of my peers at the time who was saying, what do you mean? Come on, this is a lot of hogwash. It means a lot, So anyway.
Well put. Yeah, what happens if you have a terrorist who wants to set off a bomb? Let's meet them where they're at.
Exactly. Well, that's true too. Yeah.
You want me to push the button for you?
Well, yeah. And in that way, we have to be aware if there's going to be, sometimes there's a feeling that a patient can become aggressive in a way that might be threatening. I mean, fortunately, I've never really experienced that where I have felt threatened for my own well-being, but I know people who have. So.
Oh yeah, I had 3 patients try to hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
One was in the psychiatric ward, 2 in my private practice. And you just have to deal with de-escalating these dangerous people.
Yeah.
Reminds me of the time that I took a gun away and kept it for them because they were so afraid if they took it home with them. So another time when someone pulls a knife out, another time when someone was going to come over and punch me in the face, right, my couch is here, but he was on the couch. It's just part of what happens. And hopefully that won't happen to you.
Yeah. No, actually, I do remember a patient, a husband, there was a couple came in. He was a police officer, and all of a sudden he takes out his gun and he puts it on the on the side table. And I think the issue was his wife was always demeaning him, and he was very passive. So I said, wait, excuse me, did you just put your gun on my side table? And he said, yes, obviously I have. And I said, well, I have to ask you not to bring a gun to session and to take this gun from my office. Could you do that? And then the couple had an argument about, could he put it in the car? No, we can't put it in the car. Why didn't you leave it at the station? It was a whole, but, I honestly didn't feel threatened. But now that I'm looking back at it, I'm thinking, why didn't I feel threatened? What's wrong with me?
Well, we are human, and you're not particularly ready for something when it's sprung on you like that in a moment.
Yeah.
But we learn from our experiences.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm sure we all have war stories that we could sit around and enjoy hearing.
Any other questions or comments? Additions, subtractions, revisions, amendments? emendations?
Hi. I have a question, I guess, or a comment, I guess. If it's sort of like a catch-22, because if they make the profession or the field, if they make it more scientific, so that we can get reimbursed and it can, I guess, have, you know, so they can reimburse us and we can have more, I guess, value. I mean, not that we don't have value, but it's good for that reason. But then sometimes you might fall within that same thing where it becomes superficial, because there's so many, like, you know, the fee for services, all these agencies that they just want you to prove and prove and prove, and you end up being caught up in a system and in the milieu of the agency, and you lose that essence of everything you want in the therapy with the other person, with the patient or the client. So I think that it's so hard. It's like, you know, I don't know. I do. Yes, it would be great to have something to prove what we do, sort of, so they can recognize us and give us what we, you know, what we deserve and pay us. But at the same time, I'm scared of what could happen, because they're gonna want to implement all these things. You have to do this to prove this and this, and we might get lost in that. So just something, a food for thought that I had.
Well, that's why a lot of people don't play the game. They're not on those panels. They refuse to participate in you know, bureaucratic managerial nonsense. And but if that's the only game in town and you need to get paid, yeah, it's best to have a strategy of approaching people, and the least detail is what works for me, or at least it worked for me. I've got a credential. I'm regulated. I don't need to get into the details of what I do. I help people. That's what I do. And simple as that. And if they want to say, well, you have to prove that you help people, and I say, listen, yeah, I don't have to prove anything to you. You can go talk to my board if you want. It usually doesn't go down that way, but you can get a prick on there, and you have, you know, just think how that just interferes with the treatment too, because now you got triangulated in. It interferes with the relationship, with the transference, but there's these practicalities, and everybody has to deal with practicalities. Being taught how to set up a private practice is something that is usually never done. It was never done in graduate school or my training, and I had to stumble along the way and stub my toe many times. But that's the thing that I think would be practical for any training environments, to help people get their head around what they're getting into. So thanks for your comments.
John, I think we've pretty much come to the end of the evening, and unfortunately come to the end of your 4 committed sessions. I'm grateful that you chose to offer you what you had to give us, and in your usual not only philosophical but knowledgeable self. And I can't tell you how grateful I am personally, and how grateful the New Jersey Institute for Psychoanalysis is on our behalf. So I hope to work with you again in the future. And on behalf of the rest of us here, once again, we appreciate what you gave us, and thank you very much.
Well,
now, this has been recorded. For those people who wish to get a copy of the recording, there will be a nominal charge for it. We haven't arrived at that yet. But it'll be relatively within your budget, and we want to have it for future posterity. John, you'll receive a copy of it as soon as I can get through the process again.
Well, I'm grateful, Bird, for you inviting me and everyone who's interested to listen to me blab. So thank you very much. And
Thank you very much for the plug for Jasper. We won a Gradiva Award for that article.
yeah, well deserved.
Thanks.
Well, thank you again, everyone, and
Thank you very much.
take care.
Take care, everybody.